A man named Edwig stood in the mud outside his hut in the year 1070. He watched the Norman knight, Robert de Beaumont, survey the land. This land had belonged to Edwig's village for generations. Now it belonged to Robert. The king, a foreigner named William, had given it to him. Robert pointed at Edwig's prized animal, a large healthy beast with long horns and a brown coat. Edwig had raised it from a calf. He called it a ewe. It was his family's future. It could pull a plow. Its milk made cheese. One day its hide would make leather. Robert de Beaumont did not speak Edwig's language. He spoke French. He turned to his reeve, a man who spoke both languages poorly. The reeve listened to the knight, then looked at the animal. He wrote on a piece of parchment. Robert called the meat from a grown cow boef. It was a word Edwig had never heard. Boef was what the animal became after it was taken from him. It was the word for the food on the Norman's table. Edwig knew the animal as Q, the living creature that was part of his life. Robert knew it as boef, a thing to be consumed. The reeve took the Q away. Edwig did not get paid. It was a tax. It was a conquest. He was left with the mud, the empty space where his animal used to be, and a new word he did not understand. Name that word, boef, was the sound of his loss. It was the sound of a New England, an England where the man who raised the cow did not get to eat the beef. This divide between the Anglo-Saxon word for the animal and the Norman French word for the meat was not just about language. It was about power. It was about who worked and who ate. Number 10, the word for what is taken from you is beef. Edwig lived in a small village in Yorkshire. The year was 1071. It was a year after Robert de Beaumont had taken his best cue. The winter had been hard. The Normans had marched through the north a couple of years before, burning villages and salting the fields. It was called the Harrying of the North. Edwig's older brother had died during that time, not in a battle. He just starved. There was nothing to eat. Now, things were a little better. There were crops again, but there was a constant dread. The Normans were building a castle on the hill overlooking the village. You know, you could hear the hammers and the shouting all day. It was, a raw wooden fort for now, a motte and bailey, but it was a scar on the land. It was a constant reminder of who was in charge. Edwig's family had 2 cows left. They were thin. The pasture was not good. The Normans had taken the best common land for themselves. Robert de Beaumont's steward, a stern man named Jean, came to the village every month. He carried a book. Later, people would learn that the king was making a great book of all the land and all the animals in England. It was called the Domesday Book. For now, it was just Jean's little book. And it was a book of doom for Edwig's family. Jean counted everything. He counted the people, the pigs, the chickens, and the cows. He wrote it all down. The Normans were very good at counting. They wanted to know exactly how much wealth was in the land they had taken. One day, Jean pointed to Edwig's other grown ewe. He said the word again. Boef. Lord Robert was having a feast. Edwig's father, a man named Leofwine, tried to argue. He spoke in his old English tongue. He explained that this cow was pregnant. She would have a calf in the spring. A new calf meant more milk, another animal for the future. Jean did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He shook his head. He had his orders. 2 of Robert's men at arms came forward. They had iron helmets and carried spears. Leofwine fell silent. There was no arguing with a spear. They led the cow away. Edwig watched it go. He felt a hollowness in his chest. He was 16 years old. He was old enough to understand that the world had changed forever. Before the Normans came, the lord of the land was an Anglo-Saxon man. He took a share, yes, but he spoke their language. He lived nearby. He was part of their world. These new men were different. They lived apart in their castle. They spoke a strange, clipped language, and they took whatever they wanted. They had a different word for everything. They called the forest where Edwig used to trap rabbits, La Forêt, and they said it was now the king's. They called the court where justice was supposed to happen, La Court, and it only gave justice to Normans. Edwig was sent to the castle a week later, not for the feast. He was sent to deliver firewood to the kitchens. It was a terrifying place. It was a mess of noise and smoke. The kitchen was a big dark room with a huge fire in the center. A Norman cook, a fat man with a red face, was shouting orders in French. Anglo-Saxon boys, not much older than Edwig, ran around, trying to understand. Edwig saw his cow, or what was left of it. It was hanging from a hook. 2 men were skinning it. The Norman cook pointed at a large piece of the hind leg. He shouted something, rôtir le boef, roast the beef. Edwig saw the meat. It was red and raw. He had eaten meat from a cow before, but it was a rare treat. So usually it was from an old animal that could no longer work. They would boil it in a big pot with, whatever vegetables they had. It was tough and stringy. What the Normans were doing was different. They were taking a healthy animal in its prime. They were cutting the best part for roasting. Roasting was a Norman thing. It required a big fireplace and a spit. It was wasteful. It used a lot of wood, but it was how the rich ate. He watched as a kitchen boy was forced to turn the spit. The boy sat there for hours, slowly turning the huge piece of meat over the flames. The smell filled the kitchen. It was a rich, savory smell. It made Edwig's stomach ache with hunger. He had eaten nothing but thin porridge that day. He saw the Norman lords and ladies walk past the kitchen on their way to the great hall. They were dressed in fine clothes. They were laughing. They were going to eat his cow. They would call it beef. They would not think for a moment about the family that had raised it, that it depended on it, that was now poorer because of their feast. The word beef was not just a French word for cow meat. It was the taste of conquest. It was the food of the powerful taken from the powerless. It was a word that separated the dining hall from the field, and that separation was the new reality of England. Edwig delivered his wood and left the castle. He did not look back. He knew dacu was the word for the animal you loved and cared for. Beef was the word for what was stolen from you and eaten by your masters. Number 9, pork is the sound of a forest you no longer own. Godric was a swineherd. He lived in the Weald of Kent, a vast forest of oak and beech trees. The year was 1087. King William the Conqueror had just died. His son William Rufus was now king. For Godric, it did not matter much which William was king. His life was about pigs, or as he called them, swīn. He spent his days in the forest watching his herd forage for acorns and roots. It was a good life for a pig. They were semi-wild, lean and tough, with long snouts and bristly hair. They were nothing like the fat pink pigs you might see today. They were survivors. The forest was the heart of Godric's world. In the autumn, during a time called pannage, he would drive his pigs deep into the woods. The floor of the forest would be thick with acorns. The pigs would feast. They would get fat. A fat pig could see a family through the winter. Its meat could be salted and smoked. Its fat could be rendered into lard for cooking and for light. A pig was a walking treasure chest. Godric knew every pig in his herd. He knew their temperaments. He knew which ones were clever and which ones were slow. They were his swīn. But the forest was no longer his to use freely. Since the conquest, the Normans had declared it the king's forest. This did not mean it was all owned by the king. It meant it was subject to a special, harsh set of laws, the forest law. The law was designed to protect the animals of the hunt, especially deer, but affected everything. A man could no longer gather firewood without permission. He could not clear new land for a farm, and he could not graze his pigs without paying a tax. The tax was usually 1 pig out of every 10. A Norman reeve, a man named Renaud, would come in the late autumn to count the pigs. He would walk through the herd, his nose wrinkled at the smell. He would point at the 10 fattest pigs, and then he would choose one for the Lord. Renaud did not call the animal a swīn. He called it a porc. It was the French word. For Godric, the word porc was the sound of the tax collector. It was the name of the pig he had to give up. One year, Renaud was in a foul mood. The local lord, a man named Hameau de Crevecoeur, was demanding more. He wanted more food for his garrison. Renaud walked through Godric's herd. Godric had 30 pigs. Normally, Renaud would take 3. But this time, he pointed to 5. 5 porcs, he said. 5 pigs. Godric protested. He used his simple English. He told Renaud it was not fair. It was not the custom. The custom was 1 in 10. Renaud just laughed. He had 2 armed men with him. They did not look like they cared about custom. Godric had to choose which 5 pigs to give up. It was like choosing to cut off a part of his own body. He chose the ones he was least fond of, but they were still good, fat pigs. He had spent months caring for them. He had protected them from wolves. He had made sure they found the best patches of acorns. Now, they were being led away to Hamo's castle. They would be slaughtered, and the meat on the Lord's table would be called pork. The nobles would eat roasted pork. They would have pies made from pork. They would enjoy the fruits of Godric's labor. Godric and his family would eat the rest of their pigs, the ones they were allowed to keep. They would salt the meat, which they called fleece. It was the food of survival. Pork was the food of luxury. Godric once saw the castle kitchen. He had to deliver a message from the village elder. The cook was a Norman. He was preparing a whole pig for a feast. The pig was stuffed with herbs and spices that Godric had never smelled before. Pepper, cloves, ginger, spices from faraway lands. They were incredibly expensive. The cook was basting the pork with wine. Wine! Godric had only ever tasted weak ale. This was a different world. The Normans had taken a humble swīn, an animal of the English forest, and turned it into a symbol of their wealth and power. They gave it a new name, pork, to distinguish it from the everyday food of the common man. The word itself was a barrier. It separated the fresh spiced roast in the castle from the salted meat hanging in Godric's smoky hut. It was the difference between a feast and survival. The forest still looked the same, the oaks still dropped their acorns, but the sound of the word pork was a constant reminder to Godric that the forest and everything in it no longer truly belonged to him. Number 8, they called it mutton to forget it was a sheep. Ealfric stood on a chalky hillside on the South Downs. The year was 1125. The wind was relentless. It whipped his woolen cloak around him. Below him, a sea of grayish-white backs moved slowly across the green turf. Sheep, or as Ealfric called them, scēp. He had about 200 of them. They were not his, of course. They belonged to the Bishop of Chichester, a powerful Norman cleric. Ealfric was just a shepherd. His job was to watch the scēp. He had been watching them his whole life, just as his father had before him. For Ealfric, a sheep was a walking miracle. Its wool was England's greatest treasure. Twice a year, at shearing time, the village would come alive. The men would catch the sheep and shear their thick fleeces. The women would clean and card the wool. Wool merchants would come from as far as Flanders to buy it. The bishop got rich from the wool. The village survived on the small wages they were paid for their work. The sheep's milk gave them cheese, a hard, salty cheese that would last for months. A sheep was a creature of life and wealth. You did not kill a healthy sheep. That would be like burning money. But sheep do not live forever. They get old. Their wool becomes coarse. They stop giving milk. They can no longer keep up with the flock. These were the sheep that were eaten. An old ewe or a wether that had outlived its usefulness. The meat was tough. It had a strong, gamey flavor. It had to be boiled for hours in a cauldron with herbs to make it edible. This was the meat Ealfric and his family ate a few times a year. It was a practical matter. Nothing was wasted. The Normans in the bishop's palace had a different view. They also ate sheep, but they had a different word for it. They called the meat moton. It was their word for a castrated ram, a wether. Over time, it came to mean the meat of any adult sheep. And for the Normans, moton was a food of convenience. It was not as prized as beef or venison, but it was plentiful. The kitchens at the bishop's palace cooked a lot of moton. Their cooks had ways of dealing with the tough meat. They would marinate it in wine or verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes. They would stew it with expensive dried fruits like raisins and prunes to sweeten the flavor. They would make it into pies with thick, heavy crusts. One day, the bishop's steward, a Norman named Fulk, rode up to where Ealfric was watching the flock. Fulk was an important man who ran the bishop's estates. He pointed to a young, healthy ram. It was only 2 years old. Its fleece was thick and valuable. It was the future of the flock. Fulk told Ealfric that the bishop was having an important guest, an abbot from a monastery in Normandy. They needed a special feast. They were going to roast the whole ram. Ealfric was horrified. To kill such a young, strong ram was a terrible waste. He tried to explain this to Fulk. He pointed to an older ewe, one that was limping. He said she would be better for the pot. Fulk dismissed him with a wave of his hand. He did not care about the wool. He did not care about the future of the flock. He cared about the feast. He wanted a showpiece. An old ewe would not do. He had his men seize the young ram. They took it away, bleeding in protest. Aelfric watched them go. He felt a deep sense of wrongness. The Normans did not understand the land. They did not understand the animals. They saw a sheep not as a source of wool and life, but as a potential meal. By calling the meat moton, they created a distance. It was a way to separate the act of eating from the reality of the living creature. Scēp was an animal you tended to, that you protected from harm, that provided for your family. Moton was just a dish on a menu. It was something to be consumed. That evening, Aelfric could see the glow of the fires from the bishop's palace. He could smell the roasting meat on the wind. It was the smell of waste. It was the smell of his flock's future being burned for a single night's pleasure. The word mutton became, for Aelfric, a word of disrespect. It was the word used by people who did not understand the true value of a sheep. They saw it only as meat. But for Aelfric, it was so much more. The linguistic divide was a cultural one. The Anglo-Saxon shepherd saw a long-term resource. The Norman lord saw a short-term meal. And the word mutton neatly papered over the difference, making it sound like a fancy dish instead of a squandered asset. Number 7. Veal was the price of a lord's delicate palate. For Edith lived in the marshy flatlands of Cheshire. The year was 1154. A new king, Henry II, was on the throne. He was a Plantagenet, a descendant of the Normans. For Edith, the name of the king in London mattered less than the name of the lord in the nearby castle. Her life revolved around a single precious thing, her cow, Daisy. Daisy was a small, hardy beast, well suited to the damp pastures. And in the spring she had given birth to a male calf. Edith called him Seif. The old English word was simple and direct. It meant young cow. The calf was everything. He was a promise. If he grew strong, he could be trained as an ox to pull the plow. An ox was a living tractor, the most valuable possession a poor farming family could have. Or he could be sold at the market for a good price. The money could buy a new roof for their small wattle and daub hut. It could buy salt to preserve food for the winter. The calf was security. Edith fed him carefully. She watched him take his first wobbly steps. She protected him from the cold winds. In Norman cuisine, however, had different priorities. The wealthy Norman lords and ladies valued subtlety and delicacy. They liked their meat to be pale and tender. They did not have the same appreciation for the hearty, robust flavors of Anglo-Saxon cooking. And for them, the palest, most tender meat came from a very young calf. They called this meat veal. The word came from the Old French viol, which was related to the Latin vitelluses, meaning little calf. One morning, the Lord's Reeve appeared at Edith's door. He was a man she feared. He came to collect rents and taxes, which were always a struggle to pay. But this time, he was not there for money. He said the lady of the castle was feeling unwell. The physician had recommended a strengthening broth. A broth made from the most tender meat. He had come for her calf. Edith's heart sank. She begged him. She told him the calf was their future. She offered him chickens, eggs, cheese, anything but the calf. The Reeve was unmoved. He had his orders. He said the Lord would consider it part of her rent. It was not a request. 2 men from the castle came and took the calf. It was only a few weeks old. It cried for its mother. Daisy bellowed in the field, a sound of pure distress. Edith felt like a part of her own family was being taken away. She knew what would happen to him. In the castle kitchen, the calf would be killed. Its flesh, pale and soft, would be gently simmered to make a clear broth for the lady. The rest of the meat, the veal, would be roasted or made into delicate pies for the Lord's table. It was a food of extreme luxury. It was the ultimate extravagance, consuming an animal's future for a moment of fleeting pleasure. The word veal captured this extravagance perfectly. It was a soft, smooth-sounding word. It did not sound like a baby animal. It sounded like a sophisticated dish. It allowed the people eating it to disconnect from the reality of what it was. They were not eating a sealf. They were eating veal. The difference was enormous. Sealf was a word of hope, of growth, of the cycle of farm life. Veal was a word of consumption, of indulgence, of the power of the rich to demand whatever they desired, no matter the cost to the poor. And for the rest of the year, Edith and her husband struggled. Without the promise of the calf to sell, they fell behind on their rent. They had to sell their only pig to make up the difference. The loss of that single calf had a ripple effect that pushed them deeper into poverty. Every time Edith heard someone mention the food of the castle, she would flinch. The word veal was not just a name for a type of meat. It was the sound of a future stolen. It was the taste of the deep, unbridgeable gap between the woman who raised the calf and the lady who drank the broth. Number 6, poultry, was a system, not just a chicken. Leofwin lived in a small village in the fens of Lincolnshire. The year was 1105. Her world was damp and flat, a maze of waterways and reeds. And her family's hut was small, but behind it was a patch of muddy ground where she kept her most important possessions, her birds. She had a handful of scrawny chickens, or henna, and a bad-tempered cockerel. She also had a couple of geese that she let wander by the water's edge. These birds were her personal economy. The hens laid eggs, which she could eat or, more often, trade at the market for things she could not make herself, like a new pot or a needle. The geese were for special occasions, perhaps a midwinter feast if the family was lucky. They were her responsibility. They were part of the household. Less than a mile away stood a new stone priory, home to a community of Norman monks. It was a place of great wealth and order. The priory had its own specialized departments for everything. It had a bakehouse, a brewhouse, an infirmary, and a large, well-organized kitchen, and attached to the kitchen was a department known as the pouletry. The word came from the old French pouletier, a dealer in fowl. The pouletry was run by a lay brother, a man named Robert, who was in charge of all the birds belonging to the priory. Robert's world was very different from Leofwin's. He did not just have a few chickens, he managed a vast and complex operation. He had hundreds of chickens, kept in coops. He had flocks of geese and ducks raised on the priory's ponds. He had a dovecote, a special tower that could house over 500 pigeons, providing a constant supply of young birds called squabs for the monk's table. He even had a mews where the priory's hunting falcons were kept. All of these birds, from the common chicken to the prize swan prepared for the abbot's feast day, fell under the single, organized term poultry. Poultry was a word of management and scale. It was not about a single hen scratching in the dirt. It was about the systematic production of fowl for an elite institution. The priory's diet was heavily reliant on birds. The Benedictine rule, which the monks followed, often restricted the eating of red meat from four-legged animals. So fish and fowl became staples. They ate chicken, goose, duck, pigeon, and even birds like herons and cranes that were hunted in the fens. Leofwin's relationship with her henna was personal. She knew their habits. She worried when one seemed sick. Her brother Robert's relationship with his poultry was professional. The birds were assets to be managed. He kept careful records of how many eggs were laid, how many birds were hatched, and how many were sent to the kitchen each week. It was a business. The word itself reflected this new, more organized, more commercial way of looking at things. One day, the priory's reeve came to Leofwin's village. He announced that each household now had a new tax to pay to the priory, an egg rent. Each family had to provide the priory with 20 eggs a month. For Leofwin, this was a disaster. 20 eggs was almost her entire surplus. It was her trading money. It was her safety net. She argued, but it was useless. The priory was the lord of the land. Its word was law. So now, a portion of the effort from her humble flock of henna went to supply the great pouletry of the priory. Her eggs were collected and taken to the organized storerooms managed by Brother Robert. They would be cooked for the monks, men who had taken a vow of poverty but ate better than any king. Leofwin saw the injustice clearly. The word poultry was the language of this system. It was a cold, administrative term for the birds that were a warm, living part of her own life. It was a word that lumped her precious henna in with the thousands of other birds that served the powerful. It turned her personal effort into a tiny, anonymous contribution to a vast, impersonal machine. Number 5, venison tasted of fear and a stolen right. Before the year 1066, Osbert was a hunter. He lived on the edge of a great forest in what is now Hampshire. The forest was open to him. He was a freeman. He owned a small piece of land. He could go into the woods with his bow and his dogs. He could hunt deer, the Old English word for any kind of wild beast. He would hunt the small roe deer, wild boar, and hares. The meat fed his family. The skins were used for clothing and shoes. Hunting was not a sport. It was a vital part of his survival. It was his right. After 1066, everything changed. The Norman kings were obsessed with hunting. For them, it was the ultimate sport, a form of mock warfare, and a way to show their power over the land. William the Conqueror declared vast tracts of England to be royal forest. The New Forest, right on Osbert's doorstep, was one of them. The word forest did not mean what it means today. It was not just about trees, it was a legal term. A forest was an area of land subject to the brutal forest law, reserved for the king's pleasure. Suddenly, Osbert's hunting ground was forbidden territory, or the door. He had hunted for sustenance were now protected for the king's sport. To kill a deer was a crime as serious as killing a man. The punishments were horrific. A man caught poaching could be blinded, have his hands cut off, or be hanged. The forest was no longer a place of opportunity, it was a place of fear. Foresters, the king's hated lawmen, patrolled the woods. They could enter any home without a warrant if they suspected a man of poaching. The Normans had a special word for the meat of a hunted animal, particularly deer. They called it vinion. The word came from the Latin vinatio, meaning the hundivinion was not just meat. It was the product of the aristocratic hunt. It was food that was defined by its exclusive and violent acquisition. You could not buy venison in a market. It was a food of the elite, served only on the tables of the king and the high nobility to whom he granted hunting rights. The year is 1095. Osbert is older now. He is poorer. He cannot supplement his farming with hunting. His children are often hungry. One evening, his son finds a deer caught in a thicket, its leg broken. It is a young doe. It is suffering. And it is food. Osbert knows the risk, but he cannot let the meat go to waste. Under the cover of darkness, he kills the animal and drags it back to his hut. He and his wife work quickly, butchering the deer in secret. They hide the skin and the bones. They cook some of the meat in a stew. It is the first time in years they have had such a feast. But the fear is a bitter seasoning. Every sound outside the hut makes them jump. The taste of the meat is mingled with the terror of being caught. This meat, which should have been a blessing, is a curse. This is the reality behind the fancy French word. When a Norman lord sat down to a platter of roasted venison at his feast, he was tasting his power. He was tasting his exclusive right to the land and everything on it. For Osbert, hiding in his hut, the taste of that same meat was the taste of rebellion, of desperation, and of the constant, grinding fear of the conqueror's law. The word venison is perhaps the clearest example of the linguistic divide. The Anglo-Saxon door was an animal, a part of the natural world, a resource available to the community. The Norman venison was a luxury product, a status symbol obtained through a legally protected blood sport. The word itself carries the echo of the forester's horns, the baying of the hounds, and the harsh justice of the forest law. It is the name for a food that was once a right and then became a crime. Number 4, a sauce was a cover-up in a pot. As Wulfstan was a boy of 14, and he worked in a place of constant heat and noise, the kitchen of St. Albans Abbey. The year was 1140. The abbey was one of the richest and most powerful in England. Its abbot, a Norman named Geoffrey de Gorham, lived like a prince. And he liked to eat well. The head cook, Master Guillaume, was also a Norman. He was a tyrant in the kitchen, a man of precise and demanding tastes. Wulfstan was a kitchen knave, the lowest of the low. His job was to scrub pots, fetch water, and turn the spits. He spoke only English. Master Guillaume spoke only French. Communication was mostly done through shouting and pointing. Wulfstan's idea of good food was simple. It was the pottage his mother made. A thick soup of grains and vegetables, sometimes with a bit of bacon or salted fish in it. It was cooked in a single pot over the fire. It was honest food. In the abbey kitchen, the cooking was far more complex. Master Guillaume was obsessed with one thing above all else, sauces. The word was new to Wulfstan. It came from the Old French sauce, which meant a salted or spiced relish. For Guillaume, a dish was nothing without its sauce. The abbey kitchens had a special larder just for sauce ingredients. It was filled with wonders Wulfstan had never seen. There were bags of black peppercorns from India, worth more than their weight in silver. There were cloves from the Spice Islands, mace and ginger. There were barrels of wine and vinegar. There was verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes, which was made on the abbey's own estate. There were almonds, which were ground into a fine paste to make thick white sauces. Wulfstan watched as Guillaume and his senior cooks created these sauces. They would grind spices in a mortar and pestle. They would simmer wine and herbs for hours. They would strain liquids through fine cloth. It was a kind of magic, a kind of alchemy. A sauce could transform a piece of food. It could make tough meat seem tender. It could make bland fish taste exciting. And most importantly, it could disguise the taste of food that was not entirely fresh. In an age before refrigeration, keeping food from spoiling was a constant struggle. Meat and fish were often salted or smoked, but even then, they could acquire a certain off taste. A powerful sauce full of strong flavors like garlic, mustard, vinegar, and exotic spices was the perfect solution. A peppery sauce was needed to cover any hint of decay. Wulfstan learned that a sauce was also a mark of status. The more exotic and expensive the ingredients, the more honor it brought to the host. When the abbot entertained a visiting bishop, Guillaume would pull out all the stops. He would create sauces of incredible complexity, colored yellow with saffron, green with parsley, or even red with sandalwood. The food on the high table was a rainbow of different sauces. It was a way of displaying the abbey's immense wealth on a plate. The word sauce represented this new, sophisticated, and somewhat deceptive approach to food. Anglo-Saxon cooking was about the inherent flavor of the main ingredient. Norman cooking was about what the cook could add to it, how he could change it, how he could elevate it. For Wulfstan, scrubbing the dozens of small, sticky pots used for sauce making, the word was a nuisance. It meant more work. But he also understood what it meant. It was the taste of a different culture, a culture that valued artifice and presentation. It was the taste of wealth, power, and the clever ability to make something that was a little bit old taste brand new. Number 3, to roast, was to declare you had arrived. The main cooking vessel in the hut where Wulfstan grew up was a single large iron cauldron. It hung on a hook over the central fire. Everything was cooked in it. Pottage, stews, porridge, meat, when they had it, was boiled. Boiling was efficient. It used the heat of the fire well. It tenderized tough cuts of meat. It created a broth that could be drunk or used as a base for the next day's meal. Nothing was wasted. Boiling was the cooking method of the common people of England. In the great kitchen of St. Alban's Abbey, Master Guillaume looked down on boiling. He considered it a crude and unsophisticated way to cook. For him, the noblest way to prepare meat was to rôtir it. To roast. The word came from the old French rôtir, and it described a very specific process. It required a huge fireplace, not just a central hearth. It required a long iron spit or broche, and it required a person, usually a lowly kitchen boy like Wulfstan, to sit for hours, endlessly turning the spit to ensure the meat cooked evenly. Roasting was theater. It was a spectacle of wealth. It consumed enormous amounts of firewood. The dripping fat was often lost to the fire, a sign of conspicuous consumption. The meat had to be a prime cut, a large joint of beef or a whole pig or swan to be worthy of the process. While a boiling pot was hidden in the corner, the roasting spit was the centerpiece of the kitchen, and the roasted joint was the centerpiece of the feast in the great hall. It was brought out on a great platter whole for the diners to admire before it was carved. Wulfstan's first time being assigned to spit duty was a trial by fire. The meat was a whole stag, a gift to the abbot from a local lord. It was enormous. It took 2 men to lift it onto the spit. Wulfstan's job was to sit on a small stool by the roaring fire and turn the crank, slowly, endlessly. The heat was intense. It scorched his face and hands. Smoke filled his eyes and lungs. For hours he turned. The only break he got was to baste the meat with melted fat and wine. Using a long-handled ladle, he watched the meat transform. It went from raw and bloody to a deep burnished brown. The skin crackled and crisped. The smell was overwhelming, a rich, meaty aroma that filled the entire kitchen and drifted out into the abbey's courtyards. It was a smell that announced a feast was coming. It was the smell of power. While the peasants in the nearby village ate their boiled bacon and pottage, the monks and their guests would be eating perfectly roasted venison. The word roast itself carried this sense of occasion and superiority. It was not just a way of cooking, it was a statement. It said that you had a large enough kitchen, enough fuel to waste, enough servants to turn the spit, and high enough quality meat to be cooked in this showy fashion. It was the opposite of the communal thrifty cauldron. It was individualistic and grand. When Master Guillaume shouted "Rôtir," it was an order that set in motion a whole performance of culinary power. For Wulfstan, turning the spit, sweat dripping down his face, the word roast meant hours of grueling, hot, smoky work. But it also gave him a close-up view of the great divide, the difference between those who boiled their food to survive and those who roasted it to celebrate their dominance. Number 2, bacon was the language of a new kind of butcher. The town of Norwich was growing fast. The year was 1182. It was a bustling place full of merchants, craftsmen, and soldiers from the great Norman castle that dominated the town. A man named Aethelred had a small shop in the market. He was a butcher. His father had been a farmer, but Aethelred had moved to the town to make his fortune. He was good with a knife. He knew how to break down a carcass with skill and speed. Most of his customers were English. When they wanted cured pig meat, they asked for fliques. It was the Old English word for a side of pig, salted and sometimes smoked to preserve it. It was a staple food, something you could hang from the rafters and cut a piece from whenever you needed it. It was a general term for preserved pork, but Aethelred was getting more and more new customers, Norman knights and their households, wealthy wool merchants who were adopting French manners, and they used a different word. They came to a stall and asked for bacon. The word came from the Proto-Germanic bakon, meaning back meat, and it had come into English through the French. For them, bacon was more specific than flice. It referred specifically to the cured loin and belly of the pig. He soon learned the difference. They wanted a specific product. They were willing to pay more for it. He realized that bacon was a commercial term. It was the language of the marketplace, of a more discerning customer. It was a word that sliced the pig into more precise, more valuable pieces. So Aethelred adapted. He started preparing the meat in the French style. He would cure the backs and bellies separately from the hams and shoulders. He would sell the fatty back cuts as lard. He would sell the meaty sides as bacon. He even learned the French words. He was an English butcher, but he was learning to speak the language of money. And in Norwich in 1182, the language of money was increasingly French. One day the steward from the castle, a man named Sir Guy, came to his stall. Sir Guy was a very important customer. He bought huge quantities of meat for the castle garrison. He looked over Aethelred's stall. He pointed to the beautifully cured sides of pork. "Bon bacon," he said, nodding in approval. He placed a huge order. It was the biggest sale Aethelred had ever made. He knew then that he had made the right choice. Learning the new words, the new cuts, was the key to his success. The word bacon was a small thing, but it was part of a bigger change. It was about the growth of towns and markets. And it was about the rise of specialized trades. It was about a new cash economy replacing the old system of barter and subsistence farming. An Anglo-Saxon farmer would slaughter a pig for his family and use every part of it. A professional butcher like Aethelred had to think about his customers. He had to think about what sold best. Bacon was a product, designed and named to appeal to a specific clientele. For Aethelred, the word bacon was the sound of progress. It was the sound of coins clinking in his purse. He still called it flice at home with his family. But in the marketplace where Norman and English mingled, bacon was the word that sold. It was a word that bridged the gap between the two cultures, not through force, but through the simple, powerful logic of commerce. It was a Norman word adopted by an English butcher to make a better living in a new and changing England. Number 1 dinner was an appointment you had to keep. The day in an Anglo-Saxon village was structured by the sun and the seasons. People ate when they were hungry and when the work was done. The main meal of the day was often taken in the morning, a substantial meal to provide energy for a long day of labor in the fields. There was no strict timetable. Life was fluid. In the year 1210, in the household of a minor Norman knight named Hugh de Lacy, life was not fluid. It was organized. It was structured by bells and by a strict timetable. And the most important event in that timetable was the main meal of the day. Hugh de Lacy and his household called it Disner. The word came from the Old French disner, which in turn came from a Latin term meaning to break one's fast. Disner, which, would become our word dinner, was taken around midday, perhaps 11 in the morning. It was not a casual affair. It was a formal, ritualized event. A bell would be rung, servants would bring out basins of water and towels for hand washing. Everyone would take their assigned place in the great hall. Sir Hugh and his family sat at the high table on a raised platform. The rest of the household sat at long trestle tables below them. The seating arrangement was a map of the social hierarchy. The food was served in courses. There would be soups, roasts, pies, and sweets. The best food went to the high table first. What was left over would be passed down to the lower tables. The meal could last for hours. It was not just about eating. It was about reinforcing the social order. It was a daily performance of Sir Hugh's power and status. For a young English servant girl named Alice who worked in the household, this new routine was strange and rigid. In her village, families ate together out of a common pot. Here, everything was separate and ordered. She had to learn the new words and the new customs. She learned that disner was the great meal. She also learned about super, from the French super meaning to have supper. This was a much lighter meal taken in the evening, often just some bread, cheese, and wine, or ale before bed. The words themselves, dinner and supper, represented a whole new way of organizing time. The Anglo-Saxon day was built around work. The Norman Lord's Day was built around these formal meals, as well as prayer times and administrative duties. The lives of everyone in the household, from the knight to the lowest servant, had to be scheduled around dinner. Alice had to make sure the tables were set on time. The cooks had to ensure the food was ready on time. The whole household machine had to operate in sync to make dinner happen at the appointed hour. This new vocabulary of eating was a form of social control. It replaced the organic, task-based flow of village life with the structured, clock-based schedule of the manor house. When Sir Hugh announced it was time for disner, everything else stopped. The work of the estate was organized to lead up to this moment and to resume after it. For Alice, the word dinner was the sound of a bell ringing. It was a summons. It meant she had to drop whatever she was doing and hurry to the great hall. It was a constant reminder that her time was not her own. It belonged to her lord. The introduction of these simple words, dinner and super, was not just a change in vocabulary. It was a fundamental restructuring of daily life. It was the sound of a new, more rigid, more hierarchical world, a world where you ate, not when you were hungry, but when you were told.